Hello and welcome to The Antidote. Today's topic, should it be legal for cancer patients to be prescribed and to use marijuana? Are we as a society needlessly criminalising the gravely ill at a desperate time in their lives? Are the medical benefits of cannabis being severely overstated by a vocal minority whose true agenda is to edge the country towards wholesale legalisation of this controversial drug? Here's Matthew Gilpin with more.
Cannabis. Its possession is illegal in the United Kingdom, but its position within criminal law and its classification have caused bouts of controversy for many years. Many have argued that a potentially harmless drug is being unnecessarily criminalised. Aside from its inherent recreational uses, recent studies have found that cannabis has great medical and therapeutic benefits too. In fact, across the pond in the USA, cannabis has a much greater prevalence for medical use. So much so that in certain states like California, it can be easily and legally purchased from dispensaries.
We have, frankly, a rather silly and outdated approach to drugs policy. So cannabis being a Class B drug, the idea that you can get many, many years in prison simply for having a spliff, strikes me as absurd. One of the challenges with cannabis as a medicine is that we simply haven't done the trials that are necessary to demonstrate, like any other drug, any other medicine, how well it works. Partly because we make it illegal. It has, like a whole lot of natural materials, some helpful properties and some unhelpful properties. Of course, lots of medicines have side effects. We don't rule out all medicines just because they have a side effect. So I would very quickly decriminalise all of these drugs, which I think from a law enforcement perspective makes no sense. I would also go ahead with far more research to find out about these substances, what the benefits are, and whether we can reduce the harms, quite frankly.
Right, I'm Marianne, and I've got colon cancer, which is due to having Lynch syndrome, which is a genetic form of cancer. I'm aware that cannabis is occasionally used by cancer patients as a painkiller and also as an antiemetic, which can be really helpful when you're on chemotherapy and other regimes. A lot of the medicines that we take currently that are licensed and that pharmaceutical companies produce are highly toxic and have hideous side effects. So any plants, any products that can be produced a little bit more naturally, I could certainly see having benefits. However, the side effects would need to be properly scientifically studied before I personally would want to take it.
To discuss this, I'm joined by Peter Reynolds, leader of the political party Clear, who argues for the reform of laws about cannabis use in the UK. I'm also joined by Peter Hitchens, a writer for the Mail on Sunday and author of the book The War We Never Fought, The British Establishment's Surrender to Drugs. He is also well known for his anti-cannabis views. Thank you for joining us. Now, Mr. Hitchens, you've argued that there is a strong moral case against the legalisation of cannabis because it alters consciousness. But is it morally right to deny people like Marianne the right to legally use a drug which could improve their quality of life?
Well, you used the word could, and this is the problem. We don't actually know that it would. Even people such as Professor Leslie Iverson, who's much more sympathetic to this cause than I do, have pointed out that there's grave difficulty in establishing whether cannabis just makes its users feel good or whether it actually has any proper therapeutic effects. It's very difficult, in fact, with a drug which does alter the consciousness in this way, and so obviously to conduct proper scientific double-blind tests against the placebo to discover whether it in fact works, and it has proved very difficult to do so. So there's that. Lay alongside that the growing correlation of cannabis use, especially among the young, with lifelong irreversible mental illness. And you see that the arguments against are strong. The other thing is that cannabis in a form which could be taken as a medicine would be very, very different from the cannabis which is used recreationally by the people who effectively are legally allowed to do so. I was amazed by what Julian Harpert said about people getting years in prison for possession of cannabis. Nobody gets years in prison for possession of cannabis. It's the main response of the British police to finding someone in possession of cannabis is to let them off. It's called the cannabis warning. It's the official policy of the Association of Chief Police Officers. So this is nonsense. It simply is not actually anything like as severely prosecuted as it should be.
Okay. Mr. Reynolds, do you have anything to add to those points?
You know, I just have to deny the assertions that Peter's made, because there is a copious amount of evidence that cannabis has genuine therapeutic effects. And even if there wasn't, what does it matter if it makes people feel better, particularly people who are suffering from severe illness? You know, many of the drugs that doctors prescribe are about, in fact, making people feel better. But put that aside.
It's because of the cost, the possible cost of making them feel better, which, as I say, could be lifelong mental illness. But that's not a thing to trifle with.
The cost of cannabis is the cost of prohibition. That's what the real costs to our society are.
But there isn't any prohibition, Peter, as you know very well.
Well, we spend £500 million a year in this country on enforcing the laws against cannabis.
I don't know what we do with it. John O'Connor, who was a former head of the flying squad, said in 1994 that cannabis was a decriminalised drug.
Well, and a very good thing too. And I mean, at last, 2 years ago, we had the new sentencing guidelines come out, which finally recognise that the use of cannabis for medicinal purposes is a factor in mitigation.
So what's your beef?
Okay, can I, maybe this next question will take us naturally on to an extension of that. So surely legalising marijuana strictly for medical purposes would also benefit the families, friends and carers of the ill, as they wouldn't have to see them suffering chronic pain. Would you agree with that?
Interesting you mentioned families, because it is precisely the families of cannabis users who suffer most terribly. In the case of Henry Coburn, described so movingly by his father Patrick in his book Henry's Demons. Henry, who was a very, very bright boy at a grammar school in Kent, who is now permanently dosed with antipsychotic drugs, whose prospects have hugely reduced, was a teenage user of cannabis, and is one of the many examples of this alarming correlation, which fashionable cannabis promoters ignore all the time, which is in evidence to many, many people all over this country, between cannabis use and mental illness. So why would that be? The other thing, the simple point that has to be understood about this is that you will never find a campaigner for cannabis use for medical purposes who isn't also a campaigner for cannabis use for recreational purposes. Now, I would take very seriously a campaign for the use of cannabis for medical purposes which was separate from this general legalization campaign, but it never ever is. And there's a reason for this, and I can tell you exactly what it is. Once and once only, the cannabis lobby let the mask drop. Keith Stroop, one of the leading campaigners for cannabis legalization in the United States, said in 1979, we will use cannabis as a red herring to get pot. We will use medical cannabis as a red herring to get pot a good name. He did say it. I have the actual interview here.
To move on. Okay. Mr. Reynolds, Cancer Research UK is funding research into medical cannabis use at the University of Bristol. They say it's too early to tell that the true effects of cannabis, they say it's too early to tell what the true effects of cannabis are on cancer cells. So isn't it therefore dangerous to promote cannabis as a wonder drug before the scientific community have made up its mind?
Well, the scientific community has made up its mind. I mean, I'm not saying cannabis is without risks, because nothing is without risks, okay? But I mean, relatively speaking, cannabis is a safe and benign substance. And Peter talks about the correlation with mental illness. There is some correlation with mental illness. If you actually examine the risks in detail, the risks of developing any form of mental illness correlating with the use of cannabis is about the same as being struck by lightning. So when we talk about the fact that using cannabis increases the risk of mental illness by perhaps 40%, it's increasing your risk of being struck by lightning by about 40%. And I mean, that really does put it into proper perspective.
I don't know what you base that figure on, but one of the problems is that, especially since cannabis use began to spread among school children, there has not been any widespread research, and there is always great difficulty in categorizing mental illness as well. And
I agree with
also
you.
a great lack of interest in the British health system in diagnosing mental illness, because the British National Health Service is totally uninterested in treating the mentally ill. So I think you might conceivably be underestimating that. That's really being scientifically proved. I mean, let me quote Professor Iverson on this whole business. One of the obvious complications in the medical use of cannabis is that the window between its therapeutic effects and the cannabis-induced high is often narrow. There are clearly several possible therapeutic indications for cannabis-based medicines, but for most of them, evidence for the clinical effectiveness of the drug is woefully inadequate by modern standards.
Well, let me quote Les Iverson to you as well.
Well, do by all means.
When he said in the Evening Standard, in response to a ludicrous article in your sister newspaper, the Daily Mail, which claimed that 30,000 people a year were being killed by cannabis, he said that cannabis is a safer drug than aspirin and can be used long-term without serious side effects.
Well,
and I mean, all you have to do is look at the fact that 30% of people in this country use cannabis in their lifetime. We consume more than 3.5 tons of cannabis every single day in this country. And currently there are 3 million regular users. That's at least once per month of cannabis in this country, which is 3 times the number of people who attend a Roman Catholic church regularly. So with that volume of people participating in cannabis use, where are all these
Reynolds,
mentally ill people? Where are they?
Well, there are. I think you'll.
We have to move on to the
very
next
well.
question. I am sorry. Okay, so ultimately, are you not using this argument to edge the country closer to the blanket legalisation of cannabis?
Well, I think blanket legalisation of cannabis would be a very good thing. I really do. But I'm not hiding anything. I mean, frankly, I think it's offensive. But I think the argument is offensive. The argument is offensive that people who are extremely sick and ill are being prevented from access to a medicine which is proven to help them simply because we're trying to stop a few people getting high, and trying to stop a few people getting high with a substance that is hundreds of times less harmful than the substance alcohol, which we all use to get high. I think it's offensive that people even suggest that.
Would you have any interest at all in the subject of medical cannabis if you didn't campaign for its general legalisation? Would it ever have occurred to you that it was an issue? This is pure. This is a pure front, isn't it? It's
no, not at all. My principal interest is the legalisation. My principal interest is making medicinal cannabis more widely available.
No, your principal interest is in being able to use cannabis legally yourself.
Well, with respect, Peter,
is that not so?
No, my principle.
That's not the case.
No, because I will continue to use cannabis as I wish to, irrespective of what the law says, because I consider the law to be absurd and oppressive.
Well, also you've noticed that the law isn't being enforced.
You
wouldn't dare to say that if the law were being enforced, would you?
And a very good thing too. Well, my principal interest is that I have seen, and I know you've seen as well, because I've been there when you've met them. I've seen people whose lives are transformed by cannabis, whose the alternatives they're offered, such as tramadol and opiates and really vile drugs that even if taken as prescribed, will kill them, will destroy their liver within the space of a few years. I've seen people's lives transformed by cannabis. People whose only alternative, as I say, are drugs which render them like zombies on the sofa, disconnected from their families, unable to fulfill any normal life. When they use a small amount of cannabis, they're able to engage with their families.
I have met them, and I've said to all of them one thing. I said, if you would separate yourself from Mr. Reynolds' general campaign for the legalisation of cannabis as a recreational drug, then I would be much more interested in what you say. Because actually, if they really wanted to succeed in a campaign for medical cannabis, then that's what they would do. It must make surely you must recognise that it is much, much harder for the medical cannabis campaign to succeed as long as people associate it with your campaign.
Well, my campaign is a medical cannabis campaign.
No, it's not. Your campaign is a general campaign. Clear is a general campaign.
I can tell you that I spend 95% of my time on campaigning for the medicinal use of cannabis.
Well, that's because it's a good red herring, as Keith Stroop said in 1979, and has been the case ever since. And as you acknowledge, he said,
he did, yes.
Medical cannabis is a red herring to get pot a good name.
I'm very keen that what we should do is place the responsibility for this decision in the hands of doctors, and that we should enable doctors using their professional clinical judgment to prescribe cannabis.
Now, there's only what doctors prescribe is completely governed by the fact that all drugs are regulated, and they're regulated on the grounds that their side effects have to be taken into account.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely.
Right, well, the side effects of cannabis have only just begun to be measured.
No, they haven't.
It's only 50 years since we discovered what the principal ingredient of cannabis was, and the research into it and its side effects is still actually
But we know that mankind has used cannabis for 12,000 years.
Mankind has used all kinds of things for 12,000 years.
We know that since
including machine guns. It doesn't mean that
since 1996 in California, people have been using cannabis for medicinal purposes. Where are all these crazy people?
Where are all the crazy people in California, Peter? I mean, that's not a difficult question to answer, is it? They're in California.
No, but I mean, it's just not the case.
It depends on how you define it.
It depends on and we agree on that. I mean, you and I share a considerable concern about antidepressants, for instance.
We do.
We share that. But I mean, this is a very good example. You know, we know so much about cannabis. You say more research is needed, and more research is always needed. But there are 28,000 studies on cannabis on PubMed, the US database.
Gentlemen, this is a really, really interesting discussion, but I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up. So unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you to our guests, Peter Hitchens and Peter Reynolds. We'd like to hear your thoughts, so why not join the debate on Twitter using the hashtag #TheAntidote. Do join us at the same time next week when we'll be asking whether Ebola really does threaten to become a global pandemic, or is it nothing more than a perfect media storm. Goodbye.